So I wanted to briefly make sure that I covered something in the asynchronous stuff, just in case either you missed it in the live or, I don't know, your internet connection dropped out. What we're doing this week is we are jumping into the big bad world of manual camera controls. So that means that if I'm looking here at my camera, I am, oops, turn it around for you guys, setting it to, there we go, M for manual, and that's going to be sort of where we live for the rest of the semester. Manual camera controls means that we are now controlling not just ISO, which we were controlling before. We are also, well, we're dealing with white balance, which we were sort of controlling before, but we were in black and white. This week, we'll set it to auto, AWB. Don't worry about it. We'll talk about how you can go into, Lightroom and adjust all of that, and it'll be fine. So we're controlling our aperture, our shutter speed, and our ISO. So from before, where we had one thing we were controlling, ISO, now we have three. That sounds intimidating, but we're really just setting one of them based on what we want it to look like. That's going to be our aperture. And the other video talks about sort of how your aperture, why you would choose one aperture over another, what is aperture. So once we have that set, right, then we're going to go in and adjust the other two variables, shutter speed and also ISO, to get a good exposure. So again, we're setting aperture for aesthetic purposes, and then we're setting our shutter speed and ISO to get the exposure that we want. Now, how you determine that exposure, right? Easy ways, looking at the back of your camera. More accurate ways, looking at your histogram. There's a whole PDF about the histogram that you should check out. I mean, it's only one page. It's not a whole PDF. I mean, it is a whole PDF, but it's a very small whole PDF. So the way that we do that, right? So if I'm going to take a picture, you're right, I should take my lens cap off. But if I'm here and I'm like, okay, I'm going to take this fantastic picture, I'm like, okay, I'm going to set my aperture first, right? So I'm going to set my aperture to whatever value it is that I want it to be. Let's say that I want it to be a very shallow depth of field, so I'm going to set it to a very low number like f2. What does that mean? Next video will tell you. So I've got my thing here set at f2, and I go to take a picture, super overexposed. So that's not the right exposure, right? I want to keep that aperture, but my exposure is too bright. So if my aperture is what I want, my exposure is too bright, I have two variables to change. I have my ISO and I have my shutter speed. I'm looking at my shutter speed right now. It is at a 60th of a second, right? I like it to be an 80th of a second, right? That's sort of the longest time I can have it take a picture without shaking. You're going to be working on a tripod, so it won't really matter. I look at my ISO and it's 3200. That's really high. I'm going to bring that down to some other value. Now it's at 200. Take another picture. And that looks pretty good as far as the exposure goes. So let's say that I wanted to do that picture with a very high aperture number. So like 11, 22, whatever. Right, I can do that as well. So again, I set my aperture to what I want. I go for 16. Take the picture, look at the picture, super dark, kind of just totally black. So that's too dark. I go in and I adjust my stuff. I go up to ISO, pull that back up to 3200, right? Take my shutter speed, right? If I'm working on tripod, it should be fine. Now I have it at a 30th of a second and ISO 3200, and it's still kind of dark, right? So I'm like, okay, well, I can drop my shutter speed down again. I can push my ISO up again. And now I have a decent exposure. So, right, any situation, I set my aperture to what I want for aesthetic reasons, and then I go in and I set my ISO and my shutter speed based on what I want the exposure to be. And for high ISO, higher ISO, right, more sensitive to the light, brighter exposure. Shutter speed, right, if it's a briefer amount of time that we're letting that light in, of course, less exposure happening. If I let my light in for 15 seconds, right, it's going to be a very, very bright exposure because it's a whole lot of light coming in those 15 seconds. So when you're doing it, right, I would say, try to keep your ISO not super, super high. It's not going to matter that much, but set your aperture first. Once you've got your aperture set, go in and adjust the other two. If you can keep your ISO like under 3200, that's probably great. If you can keep your shutter speed, under a second, perhaps that will be better. But again, you should be working on a tripod, so the shutter speed won't really matter that much. If you end up with a shutter speed that's 15 seconds long, again, you're on a tripod, that's fine. So for this week, right, working in manual, that's awesome. Setting your aperture first, right? Once you have your aperture set to what you want it to be for aesthetic reasons, depth of field reasons, then go in and adjust your ISO and your shutter speed to get the exposure that looks right to you.